Good evening, children, and welcome to the channel. We are currently undergoing some rearranging, so please pardon the dust. Once we are finished, uploads will continue at a more regular rate. However, today being one of my friend's birthdays, I decided to record a story she wrote. So without any further ado, I Was a Teenage Monster by Kittehfaye. I inhaled deeply as the clutches of sleep slowly released me from their grasp. Slowly I opened my eyes, blinking a few times until they adjusted to the bright sunlight streaming into my room from the window. A quick glance at my nightstand clock revealed it to be late morning, just a little after 11, and had it been a weekday, I would have been in class by now. Luckily, it was Saturday, which meant I could take my time getting up. As I sat up, I noticed a heaviness to my body that was unfamiliar to me. If I was more awake at the time, I might have been more worried. But since I had just woken up, I chalked the odd feeling up to me just feeling tired. It wasn't until I arrived at my bedroom mirror that I noticed something was wrong. Looking back at me was not a person I recognized. In fact, what was reflected in my mirror wasn't a person at all. The monster towered nearly a foot over my own height, even with its hunched, gnarled frame. My pajamas stretched and ripped in several places as the garment failed to fit the monster's body. Its sickly green skin was molted with warts and patches of thick, greasy, dark hair. Tusk-like fangs protruded from its lower mouth in a horrendous underbite. A long, purple tongue flickered out to sweep across its abnormal teeth. Dread filled me as I stared at what was my own reflection, my now yellow-green eyes wide. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice, the only thing rising up in my throat, my own bile. My hand flew to my face, frantically touching these foreign features in a desperate hope that what I was seeing wasn't real. Unfortunately, I could feel these features on my own face, and I realized with horror that this troll-like creature was indeed myself. I barely had a moment to let this realization sink in when I heard a noise outside my bedroom door. The familiar creaking noise indicating that someone had just stepped onto the bottom stair of the staircase. "Sweetie, are you up? Just because it's your birthday doesn't mean you can sleep in, you know." My mother's voice carried up the stairs and was clear enough to hear even through my closed door. Without thinking, I lunged towards my bedroom window, forcing it open as fast as I could. Despite my thoughts being a blur of panic and confusion, I knew that I couldn't let my mother see me the way I was. I felt myself climbing out the window and dropping down to the ground almost effortlessly, despite my room being on the second floor. Once my feet hit the ground, I was running, trying to put as much distance between myself and my own house. I didn't know where I was going, letting my body run on instinct, my mind too focused on the thought of what would have happened had my mother seen what I'd become. I lived alone with my mother. My father left us when I was still very young. However, he had left a lot of his belongings behind, and one of those things happened to be a shotgun. My mother had kept it, albeit hidden away, just in case a true emergency came up and we needed to protect ourselves, however slim the chance was. There was no doubt in my mind that if my mother was faced with the monster I had become, she would rely on that shotgun to protect her. My focus finally shifted as I discovered I had run to the woods not too far from my house. I looked around, taking in my surroundings. I had only been in these woods a few times when I was younger, despite my mother's frequent protests about ticks and wild animals. Those brief incursions didn't give me much knowledge of the woods, and although I knew I would most likely get lost, I forced myself to travel deeper into the wilderness. As I was now, if anyone saw me, I was most likely good as dead. This was the only place I knew of that I could go hide. My own heavy footsteps echoed in my ears as I lumbered through the woods. the dry leaves of autumn crunching under my feet. It wasn't long until the daily white noise of the suburbs faded, giving way to the natural hum of the insects in the trees. As I got further and further, I felt the adrenaline rush that had gotten me this far start to wear off. The earlier terror and panic was returning, forcing me to catch my breath. I leaned against the closest tree and was suddenly overwhelmed by my emotions. The sudden mental impact of everything making me dizzy. Once again I felt bile rise in my throat, but this time I couldn't fight back my nausea. I emptied the contents of my stomach, which wasn't much considering I had just woken up not too long ago. I dry heaved for what felt like an eternity until finally my nerves calmed down and I was able to regain a somewhat shaky sense of composure. I looked around to try and get a feeling of where I was and how far I had come. It was then that I noticed that my senses were different, as if each of my senses had taken on the attributes of different kinds of filters. My sight wasn't sharper or better focused, but instead the colors I saw were more vibrant, and I could see subtle movements a lot clearer, as if my senses honed in onto whatever motion was detected. The sounds I heard were deeper, richer, and I was able to hear a lot around me that I knew I wasn't able to hear before. The gentle scratching noises of insects traveling across the bark of the trees, or the soft shuffling of leaves as small rodents and the like traveled out of sight under the brush. Inhaling, I suddenly reeled as more scents than I could even describe entered my nose and overwhelmed my sense of smell. I found myself staggering slightly, snorting and sneezing to try and clear my nose. As soon as I could breathe normally again, I sighed and slumped down against a tree, being careful not to land where I had previously vomited. I was exhausted and getting hungry, and I had no clue as to what I was going to do now. I looked around the woods. Maybe I could find something in the woods to eat? It was the woods after all, and surely there was some sort of edible plant or berries growing somewhere. If all else failed, I could always try to catch something like a bird or a squirrel. With a firm resolve to find some sort of sustenance, I rose to my feet. I scanned the ground, my new senses of sight picking up small movements I would never have seen before. There, not too far ahead, I could see a very distinct, purposeful path of a small critter traveling under the leaves. I steadied myself, tracking the movement until I felt confident enough in my abilities to catch whatever it was under those leaves. Finally, with a burst of energy, I lunged forward, my gnarled hands disappearing under the leaves until I closed them around the creature. I was successful in my hunt. My triumph was short-lived, however, as I raised my hands to see what I had caught. Gripped in my hand was a cluster of leaves, and the middle dangled a small garden snake. It seemed a slight bit confused, but otherwise unfazed by being handled. Defeated, I dropped the leaves and the snake, watching it slither back under the layer of leaves that covered the ground. I sighed once more, noticing this time that the sound I produced was more like a guttural grunt. I kicked at the ground in frustration. Not only was I hungry and out in the middle of the wilderness, I was also a monster, unable to go back home until I could figure out what to do about my current state, if there was anything to be done at all. In the end, I wasn't going to be able to think clearly on an empty stomach, and I needed to find something to eat before I worried about going back home. I set out in search of some sort of edibles. Using my enhanced senses to the best of my ability, I was able to collect a few berries here and there, and I tracked a multitude of small animals, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch anything I found. Time passed, and I had no way to know how far I had gone or for how long I was searching. The only thing I did know was that the sun was starting to set, and I was extremely exhausted. I staggered dizzily to a large fallen tree, leaning against it to try and steady myself. My vision blurred and I felt myself falling forward. My hunger and exhaustion were too much for my body to handle, and as I hit the ground, I felt my consciousness slip away. I awoke suddenly to a car horn blaring not too far from where I was. It was pitch black out, but I could clearly see car lights dancing through the tree line in front of me. I jumped up, startled by the fact that I had wandered so close to the road. What if I had been seen? How do I know I wasn't seen? My thoughts started to race, but the feeling of my own body grounded me back to reality. The heaviness I had felt in my body earlier was gone entirely, my senses also seemingly normal. Did that mean I had turned back? I felt around my body, the foreign features of the monster now replaced by the feelings of my own natural flesh. My hands were no longer overly large and gnarled, and nowhere on my body did I feel the greasy patches of hair that I had felt before. Relief washed over me as I sagged back down to the ground. I didn't have to worry about how I was going to change back anymore, and now I could go home. Of course, that was if I could figure out where home was. I got up once more, moving slowly and carefully towards where I had seen the lights coming from. I had not noticed before, but I had been running through the woods completely barefoot. Now that I was human again, I could feel the sharp twigs and rocks beneath my feet, causing me to falter in my step. I tiptoed and wobbled my way to the road, finally finding stability as I reached the asphalt. A quick glance around told me everything I needed to know. This road was the main road that wasn't too far from my house, and I knew exactly how to get home from here. I started to run down the road, giddy with excitement that this horrid nightmare would soon be over. It didn't take me long until I found myself turning onto my own street. I stopped running, out of breath, but just happy to be almost home. I started walking towards my house, noticing that there were a few lights on, but otherwise nothing seemed out of place. I was a little surprised that my mother hadn't called the cops, but knowing her, she was probably keeping a level head and figured that if I could return home on my own, that I would. My mother, unlike myself, wasn't one to instantly panic in the face of an emergency. Almost as if to prove my thoughts, I noticed that the outside lights were on in both the front and back of the house, as if she was just waiting for me to waltz in like nothing was wrong. As I approached the house, something seemed sort of off. It didn't take long for me to realize what was bothering me. Something was moving around in my yard. At a distance, I couldn't tell what that something was, but as I got closer, dread once again set in. A monster, not unlike to the one I had turned into, was skulking around my house. I couldn't fully make it out because it was trying its best to stay out of the light, but I recognized its shape. The same shape I had taken when I turned into a monster myself. It picked its head up, sniffing at the air, and moved around as if searching for something. What if it was searching for me? I ducked down out of sight behind a car parked on the street, my thoughts racing in my head. What was that thing? Why was it there? Was it actually searching for me? Was it the reason I had turned into a monster myself? Was my mother okay? That last thought made my blood freeze in my veins. I hadn't been home all day, and with the lights on in the yard, surely there was no way my mother would have noticed the monster if she was waiting for me to come home. Despite this, the monster was there, and I saw no movement in my house to confirm where my mother was or if she was okay. Actually, there was no movement from any house at all. It was obviously very late, and everyone was most likely asleep, but how could no one notice this thing wandering around in my backyard? Something was very wrong here. I peeked over the hood of the car I remained hidden behind, trying to figure out what to do. If I got too close to my house, I would most likely be seen, and I had no way to protect myself from that thing. If I stayed where I was, however, there was a chance that I was putting my mother in danger, if she wasn't in danger already. I had to figure out how to either get inside without being seen, or I had to take care of the monster myself. As I thought, I heard the monster snarl, and I immediately ducked back down behind the car. If that monster was looking for me, I had limited time to think, and if it did find me, What then? Once more I dared to peek out from my hiding spot. The monster had moved to the far side of the yard, away from the house and the storage shed. As I stared at the storage shed, I realized what I could do. The place my mother hid the shotgun was in that shed, and if I could get to that, I'd at least have protection if the monster came at me. But if I was going to get to the shed, I had to act fast. Without another thought, I darted out of my hiding spot and towards the house, trying my best to make a beeline for the storage shed. As I ran, I saw the monster's head snap towards me, and without a moment's hesitation, it started to chase me down. I swerved to the right across the front yard, forcing the monster to chase me around the house as I tried my best to keep it from getting between me and the shed. It continued its pursuit as I rounded the back of the house, almost to the shed. I couldn't look back, but I knew it was closing the gap between us, and in desperation, I lunged for the shed door. To my surprise and relief, I found the door to be unlocked. I swung it open just as the monster was about to reach me, slipping inside and shut the door closed as fast as I could. The monster slammed into the door with all its force, and from the other side I heard a horrific, primal howl. In the darkness I fumbled, reaching out in front of myself to try and regain my bearings. My hands met the wall in front of me, and with that, I was able to recover my balance. I straightened up, but it was so dark I was unable to see anything, let alone look for the shotgun. I didn't have much time to think, and urgency set in as I heard the doorknob start to turn. The door opened, the backyard light flooding into the shed around the silhouette of the monster. It grunted and growled, taking a step towards me as I backed away in fear. I looked around, furiously trying to find something, anything that would protect me, when my eyes finally landed on the shotgun hanging on the wall. I snapped up the gun, cradling it in my arms and pointing it at the monster, who seemed to stop dead in its tracks. Did it know what a shotgun was? Did it suddenly sense it was in danger? Distantly I heard sirens. Sirens? I looked past the monster to see that quite a few houses now had their lights on. The commotion it had made must have woken the neighbors up, and someone must have called the police. Another grunt drew my attention back to the monster, and I pumped the shotgun with my finger on the trigger. I wasn't sure if I was even using the gun right, but the monster was obviously still scared. Once more the monster howled, and as it tried to reach for me, I pulled the trigger. Click. I blinked in confusion and tried again. Click. How foolish was I to think that the shotgun would be there, hanging fully loaded. The monster stared at me and blinked as if it was unsure of what to do. I could do nothing but stare back at it, dumbfounded and numb. The only protection I thought I had was now useless, and the monster was right in front of me, blocking the doorway completely. I was trapped. The sudden sound of multiple car doors slamming closed drew both mine and the monster's attention to outside the shed. I couldn't see past the monster, but I could clearly hear a number of people running into the backyard. Multiple beams of light from flashlights bounced around my vision. "What in the hay?" I heard a male's voice suddenly shout, no doubt spotting the monster. The monster turned away from me and howled at whoever was behind it. "Shoot it! Shoot it!" I heard more yelling, guns being cocked, and the monster turned frantically towards me. It looked at me in desperation, opening its mouth as if to say something, but the only thing I heard was guns firing. Shot after shot was fired as I saw the monster's body jerk with each hit. I felt my own body be propelled backward as a shot went past the monster, hitting me in the shoulder. The cops obviously didn't know I was in front of the monster, and because of that, they continued to fire. The monster howled at me in pain and started to fall forward towards me. A few more shots and it was down, laying at my feet as the blood poured from its wounds. I looked down at it, my vision wavering, and as I looked down I noticed a large red spot blooming on the front of my shirt. I swayed. Everything was fading slowly. My body felt numb. I fell to my knees, my sight glazing over as everything got darker. I saw lights bouncing around in various movement. I heard jumbled dialogue, but nothing I could focus on. The only thing I could focus on was the monster that lay dead in front of me. The monster that was turning pale, that was shrinking. The monster that wasn't a monster. My mother, laying in front of me, riddled with bullet holes. I lost consciousness. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed that one. And remember, if you have a story you would like to hear featured on the channel, simply let me know. That's all for tonight. Please remember to like and subscribe. Also, make sure to stop by Kittehfaye's YouTube channel. There will be a link in the description below. Stay creepy, my fiends, and good night.